The T-34 sat motionless in the snow, its olive green paint blackened by soot, its right track half buried in frozen mud. Inside, Sergeant Alexei Morozov pressed his forehead against the periscope, watching German infantry move through the smoke-choked ruins 300 meters ahead. His breath came in shallow clouds. The cramped fighting compartment smelled of diesel, burned rubber, and something metallic that made his teeth ache. Behind him, the gunner was coughing into his sleeve, and the loader had gone silent 20 minutes ago, staring at nothing. The driver, Corporal Dmitry Volkov, sat frozen at his controls, waiting for an order that might never come. Morozov's hands were shaking, not from cold, not from fear exactly, from the knowledge that the next 5 minutes would determine whether they died as soldiers or burned alive as trapped animals. The fuel line was leaking. He could hear it dripping onto the engine deck, a steady tick-tick-tick like a metronome counting down to oblivion. One direct hit, one spark in the wrong place, that's all it would take. This wasn't how the day was supposed to end. This wasn't how the counteroffensive was supposed to go. But then again, nothing in this war had gone according to plan since the Wehrmacht crossed the border in June of 1941. The Germans had taken Kharkov in October of 42 after months of brutal fighting. Stalin had ordered it retaken at any cost. The cost, as it turned out, was measured in thousands of frozen corpses and hundreds of burning tanks scattered across the Ukrainian steppe. Now, in the third week of February, the Soviet forces had pushed the Germans out of the city center, but the Wehrmacht wasn't retreating, they were regrouping. And in this war, when the Germans regrouped, people died. Morozov's unit, part of the 1st Guards Tank Army, had pushed too far forward during the morning assault. Their supporting infantry had fallen behind, pinned down by machine gun fire from a factory complex. His tank and 2 others had rolled ahead anyway, trying to exploit a gap in the German line. It was textbook Soviet doctrine: speed, aggression, deep penetration into enemy positions. But doctrine didn't account for PaK-40 anti-tank guns hidden in cellars, or for Panzer IVs appearing from side streets like ghosts. The other 2 T-34s in his platoon were burning wrecks now, their crews dead before they could even open the hatches. Morozov's tank had taken a glancing hit to the rear deck. Not enough to penetrate the armor, but enough to crack the fuel line and send them limping into this shell crater at the edge of the city, hull down behind a collapsed brick wall. He'd radioed for support. Nothing. The regimental frequency was chaos, voices screaming grid coordinates, calling for ammunition, reporting entire companies wiped out. The German counterattack had caught them off balance. Again. How many times had this happened? How many times had Soviet commanders thrown their tanks forward without proper reconnaissance, without air support, without any realistic chance of holding the ground they took? Morozov had stopped counting after Stalingrad. The gunner, Junior Sergeant Pavel Kuznetsov, wiped blood from his nose and turned to look at Morozov. His face was pale, his eyes wide. "Commander, we need to abandon. The fuel. You can smell it. One more hit and we're finished." Morozov didn't answer immediately. He was watching the Germans. They were moving carefully now. 3 squads of infantry in field gray, spreading out in a textbook encirclement pattern. They'd already spotted the T-34. That much was obvious, but they were hesitating, keeping their distance. Why? Because disabled Soviet tanks had a nasty habit of coming back to life at the worst possible moment, because even a crippled T-34 with 1 round left could still kill half a dozen men. The Germans had learned to be cautious, but cautiousness had limits. Sooner or later they'd call up a PaK gunner radio for a tank destroyer. Or worse, they'd simply wait for nightfall and cook the crew out with grenades and small arms fire. Either way, the outcome was the same. Morozov and his men would die here, in this frozen crater, surrounded by the ruins of a city that had changed hands 3 times in 18 months. "We bail out, we're dead in 30 seconds, Morozov said quietly. His voice sounded strange in his own ears, flat and distant. "Look at the terrain. No cover between here and our lines. They'll cut us down before we make 10 meters. The loader, Private Grigory Sakharov, finally spoke, his voice cracking. "So, we just sit here and burn? That's your plan? Wait until they hit us again and roast like pigs?" Morozov turned to face his crew. In the dim red light of the combat lamps, their faces looked like those of corpses already. Kuznetsov's nose was still bleeding from where he'd smashed it against the gun sight during the hit. Sakharov had a burn on his left hand from touching the breech after rapid firing, Volkov, the driver, hadn't said a word since they'd stopped, but his knuckles were white on the control levers. These were good men. They'd been with him since the tank was issued back in November. They'd fought through the relief of Stalingrad, through the Don offensive, through the first push toward Kharkov. They deserved better than this. They deserved a commander who could get them out alive. But sometimes there was no way out. Sometimes there were only bad options and worse options. And sometimes, if you were very lucky or very insane, there was a third option that nobody had thought of yet. Morozov's mind went back to Stalingrad, December of '42, the factory district. He'd been a gunner then, not a commander, serving in a K-1 heavy tank that had lost its main gun to a German 88. They'd limped into the ruins of the Red October steel plant, expecting to die, when they'd encountered a Soviet engineer unit doing something that seemed completely mad at the time. The engineers had taken several destroyed Soviet tanks, positioned them in choke points throughout the factory complex, and rigged them with drums of aircraft fuel and delayed fuses. When German armor rolled past at night, thinking the wrecks were harmless, the engineers would detonate the fuel drums remotely. The resulting fireballs weren't powerful enough to destroy a Panzer outright, but they didn't need to be. The flames would blind the German crews, illuminate the tanks for Soviet anti-tank guns positioned nearby, and create enough chaos to stall the advance. It was crude. It was desperate. It was exactly the kind of improvised insanity that characterized Soviet tactics when everything else had failed. Morozov had watched one of these ambushes unfold from a cellar 200 meters away. A Panzer III had been rolling cautiously past a burned-out T-34 when the wreck suddenly erupted in a pillar of flame. The German tank had stopped, its commander probably trying to figure out what had just happened, and in those 5 seconds of hesitation, a Soviet 45mm gun had put 3 rounds through its side armor. The Panzer had burned for hours, its ammunition cooking off in sporadic explosions, and Morozov remembered thinking, that's what desperation looks like when it gets creative. Now, sitting in his own crippled tank with German infantry closing in, that memory surfaced like a body rising from deep water. An idea. Insane. Probably suicidal. But maybe, just maybe, less suicidal than the alternatives. He looked at the fuel gauge. Quarter tank. Not much, but the leak meant most of that was already spreading across the engine deck and dripping onto the ground beneath them. He looked at the ammunition rack. 3 rounds left, 2 high explosive fragmentation shells and 1 armor-piercing round. He looked at his crew, their faces expectant, waiting for orders that would either save them or kill them. "Listen to me," Morozov said, and his voice had changed now, sharp with sudden purpose. "We're not abandoning. We're not waiting to burn. We're going to do something the Germans won't expect." Kuznetsov stared at him. "What are you talking about?" Morozov pulled himself toward the engine compartment bulkhead, yanking open the small access panel that let the crew perform emergency repairs without leaving the tank. Smoke billowed through immediately, making them all cough, but he could see what he needed to see. The damaged fuel line still dripping diesel onto the hot engine block. The engine had been shut down for 10 minutes now, but the metal was still warm enough to steam in the frigid air. "We're going to make them think we're already dead," Morozov said. "We're going to let this tank catch fire. And when they come close to loot the wreck, we're going to put one last shell exactly where it needs to go." The silence that followed was profound. Then Kuznetsov said very carefully, "Commander, with respect, that's not a plan. That's suicide with extra steps." Morozov pulled a wrench from the emergency toolkit and held it up. "Stalingrad, Red October plant. Engineers used burning wrecks as bait. Set them on fire, waited for Germans to approach, then detonated them or hit them from ambush. I saw it work 3 times. Sakharov's voice rose half an octave. "Those were remote detonations. We're inside this tank." "Yes!" Morozov was already moving, crawling partially through the bulkhead access. "Which means we control the timing. We control when the fire starts. We control when we fire." Volkov finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "And we control when we burn to death if this goes wrong." Morozov didn't deny it. He positioned himself in front of the damaged fuel line, studying the leak. It was a clean crack, probably from shrapnel impact. Diesel was pooling in the maintenance channel, dripping through gaps in the deck plates. If he widened the crack deliberately, he could direct the flow, create a controlled leak that would spread fuel exactly where he wanted it, exactly when he wanted it. "Here's how this works," he said, speaking quickly now because he could hear German voices outside getting closer. "I'm going to loosen this line deliberately, direct the leak toward the hull maintenance hatch. That puts fuel on the exterior, where it can ignite without cooking us immediately. Kuznetsov, you load the armor-piercing shell. Target that half-track I saw moving up on our left flank, range 200 meters. Sakharov, you stay ready to load the fragmentation rounds if we get a second chance. Volkov, you keep your hands on the controls. If this works and we need to move, you've got exactly one chance to get us out." Kuznetsov was shaking his head slowly, but his hands were already moving toward the ammunition rack, pulling out the heavy armor-piercing round. "This is insane. You know that, right? This is completely insane." "Everything about this war is insane," Morozov said. We're just adapting." He positioned the wrench on the fuel line coupling. One turn. That's all it would take. One turn and the leak would become a flood, diesel spreading across the hull exterior, pooling around the engine vents. One spark and they'd be surrounded by flame. But that was the point. The Germans expected disabled Soviet tanks to burn. They expected crews to bail out or die inside. What they didn't expect was a tank that deliberately set itself on fire and then kept fighting. The psychological shock of it, the sheer unexpectedness might buy them 5 seconds, maybe 10. And in combat, 5 seconds was the difference between a killing shot and a clean miss. Morozov turned to look at his crew one more time. They were terrified. Of course they were. They had every right to be. But they were still here, still at their stations, still following orders, even though those orders made no rational sense. That was the Soviet soldier in a nutshell, following insane orders because the alternative was giving up, and giving up meant death. And if you were going to die anyway, you might as well die doing something that scared the enemy even more than it scared you. "On my mark," Morozov said. He gripped the wrench. Outside, he could hear German voices very close now, shouting orders, coordinating their approach. They'd be visible through the periscope any second now. "Kuznetsov, you see that half-track?" The gunner pressed his eye to the sight. "Acquired. Range. 220 meters. Slight angle. They're stopped, dismounting infantry. Perfect. A stationary target packed with men. One armor-piercing shell through the fuel tank would turn that half-track into a fireball, and the shrapnel would cut down anyone standing nearby. But they had to wait. Had to let the Germans get closer. Had to sell the illusion that this was just another knocked-out Soviet tank, harmless, ready to be stripped for watches and rations. Morozov positioned himself back at his commander's station, wrench still in hand. Through the periscope, he could see them now. German infantry moving in squad formations, weapons raised, covering each other as they advanced. They were good, professional, cautious but confident. They'd done this 100 times before, approaching Soviet wrecks, clearing them, moving on. Just another day on the Eastern Front. Then, one of the Germans stopped, raised his hand. The squad halted. The soldier was pointing at Morozov's tank, shouting something. Morozov's German was limited, but he caught the words Bewegung. Ich sehe Bewegung. Movement. I see movement. Someone inside must have shifted, created a shadow in the vision port. The Germans had spotted it. They were backing up now, taking cover, bringing up a Panzerfaust. Morozov watched the distinctive tube-shaped weapon appear, a soldier kneeling to take aim. Effective range, 60 meters, more than enough to finish what the Pak gun had started. "Now," Morozov said. He turned the wrench. Hard. The coupling cracked fully open and diesel exploded out of the line, spraying across the engine compartment, flooding through the maintenance hatch, spreading across the exterior hull plates. The smell filled the fighting compartment instantly, overwhelming, choking. Morozov slammed the access panel shut and threw himself back to his station. "Kuznetsov, on target? On target. Wait for my command." Morozov pressed his eye to the periscope. The German with the Panzerfaust was aiming carefully, taking his time. He had a clean shot, no reason to rush. The T-34 wasn't going anywhere. The Panzerfaust fired. Morozov saw the flash, saw the projectile streak toward them, and had just enough time to think, this is either going to work or we're about to find out what burning alive feels like before the world turned white and sound ceased to exist. The explosion hit the right side of the tank, exactly where the fuel was pooled. The shaped charge detonated. Normally, that would have been the end. The explosion would have penetrated the armor, sent a jet of superheated metal through the fighting compartment, killed everyone inside in a fraction of a second. But the leaking diesel changed the equation. The fuel ignited instantly, creating a massive fireball that erupted outward through every vent, every gap, every opening in the tank's hull. The explosion's force blew burning diesel across a 10-meter radius, creating exactly what Morozov had hoped for: a wall of flame surrounding the tank. Inside the T-34, the world was chaos. The concussion slammed them against their stations. The temperature spiked instantly, the air turning so hot it hurt to breathe. Smoke poured through every seal in the armor. Morozov's ears were ringing so badly he couldn't hear his own voice, but he was screaming anyway. Fire! 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 Kuznetsov couldn't hear him. Didn't matter. The gunner knew his job. Through vision slits that were half obscured by flames and smoke, Kuznetsov tracked his target. The half-track was still there, 220 meters away, infantry dismounting, completely focused on the burning Soviet tank that was supposed to be dead. The gunner made a tiny adjustment, compensating for the angle. His hands moved with the automatic precision of thousands of hours of training. Traverse, elevation, range. The 76mm cannon fired. The armor-piercing shell crossed the distance in less than a second. It hit the half-track just below the driver's compartment, penetrated the thin armor, and detonated the fuel tank inside. The explosion was catastrophic. The half-track's rear compartment, packed with infantry, ammunition, and fuel, simply disintegrated. Men were thrown into the air like rag dolls. Secondary explosions rippled through the wreckage as ammunition cooked off. The Germans who'd been standing nearby were cut down by shrapnel and burning debris. Morozov saw it through the flames, through the smoke, through the distortion of overheated air and combat stress. He saw the half-track die, saw the infantry scatter, saw the carefully coordinated German advance collapse into chaos as soldiers dove for cover, trying to understand what had just happened. A burning tank had killed them. A knocked-out wreck had opened fire. It violated everything they knew about how destroyed Soviet armor behaved. But Morozov didn't have time to appreciate their confusion because his own tank was genuinely burning now. The diesel fire had spread from the exterior to the engine compartment. Flames were licking through the access panel seals. The temperature inside the fighting compartment was rising rapidly, crossing from unbearable to lethal. Sakharov was screaming. Volkov was trying to start the engine, probably thinking they could still move, still escape, but the engine wouldn't turn over. Too much damage, too much heat. Morozov grabbed Kuznetsov by the shoulder and pointed at the ammunition rack. The gunner understood immediately. They had 2 more shells, 2 more chances. But to fire again meant staying inside this furnace, breathing superheated air that was already searing their lungs, working the gun mechanisms with hands that were starting to blister. Kuznetsov grabbed a high-explosive shell and rammed it into the breech. His hands were shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. Morozov swung the turret manually, using the hand crank because the hydraulics were starting to fail. Through the periscope, everything was flames and smoke. He could barely see, barely breathe. His vision was tunneling, black edges creeping in. There. Movement. German infantry trying to flank their position, using the smoke for cover. Morozov put the targeting reticle on the center of the formation and shouted something that might have been fire, or might have been just a wordless scream. Kuznetsov pulled the trigger. The high-explosive shell detonated among the German infantry, sending shrapnel tearing through their ranks. The blast ignited dry grass that neither Morozov nor the Germans had noticed was there, dead vegetation from the previous summer, covered by snow until the fire had melted through. The grass caught instantly, and suddenly the flames were spreading beyond the tank, racing through the ruins, jumping from the grass to wooden debris to the wreckage of other vehicles. Within seconds, the entire area around the T-34 was burning. The Germans retreated. They had no choice. The fire was spreading too fast, the smoke too thick. They pulled back toward their own lines, leaving their dead behind, leaving the burning half-track behind, leaving the impossible Soviet tank that had refused to die. Inside that tank, Morozov's crew was dying anyway. Slowly. Horribly. The temperature had climbed past the point where human beings could function. The air was unbreathable. Morozov tried to give an order, tried to tell them to bail out now while the Germans were retreating, but his throat was too burned to form words. He saw Sakharov collapse against the ammunition rack, saw Volkov slump over his controls, saw Kuznetsov press his face against the gun breech, probably hoping the metal would be cooler than the air. It wasn't. Morozov's last conscious thought was that he'd kept his promise. They hadn't abandoned the tank. They'd fought to the end. They'd taken Germans with them, and if they died here, at least they died the way Soviet tankers were supposed to die, inside their steel coffin, guns still firing, enemies still dying. Then the darkness took him. What happened next became the subject of debate among military historians for decades, primarily because the men who experienced it were unconscious for most of it and barely coherent when they finally told their stories. The official Soviet report, filed by Captain Grigory Romanov of the 5th Mechanized Infantry Regiment, states that his unit retook the area around the Kharkov city limits at approximately 1800 hours on February 22nd. They found extensive fire damage, several destroyed German vehicles including a burnt-out half-track, and approximately 15 German casualties scattered across a 100-meter radius. At the center of the destruction was a T-34 medium tank, hull number 217, so badly burned that the paint had been carbonized off the armor. The tank was assumed to be abandoned until one of Romanov's men heard tapping coming from inside. Faint, rhythmic. Someone was alive in there. It took them 20 minutes to get the hatches open. The external latches had warped from the heat. When they finally pried the commander's cupola open, smoke poured out so thick and acrid that the first man who looked inside immediately vomited. But behind the smoke were 4 Soviet tankers, unconscious but breathing, their uniforms burned, their skin blistered, their faces black with soot. Somehow, impossibly, they were alive. Morozov woke up 3 days later in a field hospital, his throat so damaged he couldn't speak above a whisper. His hands were wrapped in bandages. His face felt like raw meat. The first thing he tried to do was ask about his crew. The nurse told him to rest. He tried again. She told him again. On his 3rd attempt, a doctor finally came over and explained all 4 of them had survived. Volkov had 2nd-degree burns across 40% of his body. Kuznetsov had severe respiratory damage from inhaling superheated air. Sakharov had lost consciousness from heat exhaustion and had been seconds away from permanent brain damage when they'd been extracted. But they were alive. Against all probability, against all military logic, against everything the laws of physics and human physiology suggested should have happened, they were alive. The doctor wanted to know how. How had they survived inside a tank that had burned hot enough to warp steel? How had they maintained consciousness long enough to fire multiple rounds? How had they not suffocated from smoke inhalation in the first 60 seconds? Morozov didn't have good answers. His memory of the final minutes was fragmentary at best. He remembered making the decision to open the fuel line, remembered the Panzerfaust hit, remembered Kuznetsov firing at the half-track. After that, everything was heat and pain and darkness. He didn't remember the grass catching fire, didn't remember the Germans retreating, didn't remember the Soviet infantry arriving. His brain had shut down somewhere in the middle of it all, protecting itself from sensory input that would have driven him insane. But piecing together testimony from his crew and from the infantry who'd found them, a picture emerged. The fire surrounding the tank had burned intensely but briefly. Diesel fires burn hot but consume their fuel quickly. By the time the hull itself had started to heat to lethal temperatures, most of the external fuel had burned away. The wind had been blowing from the west, carrying the worst of the smoke away from the tank rather than into it. And critically, the tank had been hull down in a shell crater, partially below ground level, which meant it was partially shielded from its own fire. These factors, combined with pure dumb luck, had created a narrow window where the crew could survive just long enough for rescue to arrive. None of this was planned. None of it was calculated. Morozov had made his decision based on a half-remembered story from Stalingrad and the desperate hope that dying while fighting was better than dying while running. Everything else was chance, but chance has a way of turning into legend. Within a week, the story of Tank 217 had spread through the 1st Guards tank army. The details got embellished in the retelling, as stories always do. Some versions claimed Morozov had destroyed 3 German vehicles, not just one. Others said he deliberately lured an entire German platoon into a trap. One particularly creative version had him surviving through some kind of special breathing technique he'd learned from a Siberian shaman. The truth was less dramatic, but more interesting. What Morozov had done was weaponized desperation. He'd taken a situation where death was certain and found a way to make that death cost the enemy something. The fact that he'd survived was almost incidental to the tactical principle he'd demonstrated. A disabled tank doesn't have to be a passive victim. Under the right circumstances, with the right crew, it can become one final weapon, one final threat, one final source of uncertainty for the attacking force. The Soviet High Command took notice, not immediately. They were too busy losing Kharkov again in mid-March when Field Marshal Manstein's counteroffensive pushed them back across the Donets River. But later, during the summer of '43, when the Red Army was preparing for the defense of the Kursk salient, someone remembered the burning T-34 that had refused to die. A directive went out to tank commanders. In the event of catastrophic damage with no possibility of withdrawal, crews were authorized to employ unconventional defensive measures, including, but not limited to, deliberate fuel ignition for area denial purposes. It was bureaucratic language for what Morozov had done. Make your death expensive. Make the enemy pay for every meter. Turn your coffin into their nightmare. Whether this directive ever resulted in similar actions is unclear. Soviet wartime records are incomplete, contradictory, and often deliberately vague about tactical failures. But there are scattered references in German after-action reports from Kursk and later battles, Soviet tanks that appeared destroyed suddenly opening fire, disabled vehicles erupting in flames that spread to attacking infantry, unexplained explosions around knocked-out armor. Whether these were the result of Morozov's crazy trick being officially adopted or simply other desperate crews reaching the same conclusion independently, we'll probably never know. What we do know is that Morozov returned to duty in May of 1943 given a new T-34 and a new crew. His old crew recovered more slowly. Volkov was invalided out of the tank corps, his burns too severe for him to handle the cramped driver's position. Sakharov was transferred to infantry. Only Kuznetsov returned to tank service, though with permanent lung scarring that would trouble him for the rest of his life. Morozov fought through the rest of the war: Kursk, the liberation of Ukraine, the Vistula-Oder offensive. He was wounded twice more, promoted twice, decorated 3 times. He never discussed the incident at Kharkov except in the most clinical terms, as if it had happened to someone else. In his rare interviews after the war, when Soviet journalists wanted to celebrate his heroism, he deflected. What he'd done wasn't heroism, he insisted. It was mathematics. 4 men in a disabled tank versus an enemy infantry company. The equation only worked one way. You made the enemy pay. You made every second of your survival cost them something. That wasn't courage. That was just basic tactics. But the men who served under him later knew better. They saw how he handled crisis situations, how he stayed calm when tanks were burning around him, how he found solutions in situations where there shouldn't have been any solutions. They called him the one who wouldn't burn, though never to his face. And when they told stories about him in the barracks late at night, when the vodka was flowing and the war felt both very close and very far away, they always came back to Kharkov. To the moment when a sergeant with a wrench and a terrible idea turned his tank into a flame trap and somehow lived to tell about it. The larger question, the one that military analysts debated in the decades after the war, was whether Morozov's actions represented anything more than a lucky desperation play. Did it reveal something fundamental about Soviet tactical doctrine, this willingness to embrace methods that bordered on suicidal? Was it a strength or a weakness that Soviet soldiers were trained to see their own deaths as merely another tactical resource to be expended efficiently? The answer probably depends on where you stand. From a Western military perspective, what Morozov did was insane. You don't deliberately set your own vehicle on fire. You don't put your crew at risk of burns and asphyxiation. You preserve your forces. You withdraw when necessary. You live to fight another day. These are the principles of rational military planning. But the Eastern Front wasn't rational. It was a war of extermination being fought with industrial age weapons and medieval brutality. It was a war where entire armies were encircled and annihilated in weeks, where cities were reduced to rubble, block by block, where the distinction between soldier and civilian meant almost nothing because everyone was a target. In that context, Morozov's decision makes a different kind of sense. When retreat means death and surrender means death and staying still means death, you might as well die in the way that hurts the enemy most. You might as well go down fighting in a manner so unexpected, so shocking, that it gives the next Soviet soldier a tiny advantage. That's not heroism. That's not even really courage. It's just the arithmetic of survival in a war where survival itself had become almost impossible. The physical evidence of what happened that day disappeared quickly. The T-34 was salvaged for parts and scrap metal. The battlefield was fought over 3 more times before Kharkov finally remained in Soviet hands in August of 1943. The shell crater where Morozov made his stand was filled in during post-war reconstruction. Today, if you visit the outskirts of modern Kharkiv, there's nothing to mark the spot where 4 men turned their tank into a bomb and somehow lived to tell about it. But the story persists. In Russian military academies, it's sometimes used as a case study in improvisation under fire. In veterans organizations, it's told as an example of Soviet resilience. In online forums where military enthusiasts debate the details of Eastern Front battles, it's argued over endlessly. Did it really happen the way the reports describe? Were the Germans really fooled? Could anyone actually survive those conditions? The skeptics have good points. The whole thing sounds too dramatic, too perfectly structured, too much like propaganda. And maybe it was propaganda, at least in part. The Soviet war machine needed heroes. It needed stories that proved Soviet soldiers were tougher, smarter, more resourceful than their German counterparts. It needed narratives that justified the horrific casualties and explained why losing 10 tanks to destroy 1 German vehicle was actually a victory. Morozov's story fit that need perfectly. The humble sergeant who refused to surrender. The crew that stayed with their tank to the end, the desperate gamble that paid off against impossible odds. It's the kind of story that gets embellished, refined, turned into myth. But here's the thing about myths. They're usually built on a core of truth. Something happened outside Kharkov on February 22, 1943. A Soviet tank that should have been destroyed kept fighting. A German attack that should have succeeded was repulsed with heavy casualties. 4 Soviet tankers who should have died were pulled from their burning vehicle barely alive, but alive nonetheless. These are documented facts, recorded in reports from both sides. How much of the dramatic details are accurate? How much of Morozov's internal reasoning actually happened versus being reconstructed later? How much of the fire and smoke and last-second shots are real versus narrative embellishment? We'll never know for certain. The only people who could definitively answer those questions are dead now. Morozov died in 1993. Kuznetsov in 2004. Volkov and Sakharov sometime in the 80s, their deaths barely noted in regional newspapers. What remains is the essential truth underneath the story, that in the desperate mathematics of the Eastern Front, Soviet soldiers found ways to make their deaths expensive. They found ways to turn defeat into at least a Pyrrhic victory for the enemy. They improvised, they adapted, they did things that made no sense from a conventional military perspective but made perfect sense when you were staring at your own imminent death and trying to figure out how to make it mean something. That's what the flame trap of Kharkov represents, in the end. Not heroism, not even really tactics. Just the cold calculation of men who knew they were going to die and decided that if they were going down, they'd take as many of the enemy with them as possible. In a war that killed 27 million Soviet citizens, that kind of determination mattered. It didn't win battles by itself. It didn't change the strategic situation, but it accumulated loss by loss, sacrifice by sacrifice, until eventually the weight of it broke the Wehrmacht's advance and sent them reeling back toward Berlin. Morozov's crazy trick was just one small part of that vast, terrible accumulation. 1 tank, 1 crew, 1 desperate gamble on a frozen February afternoon. But multiplied across thousands of similar moments, in hundreds of similar situations, it became something larger. It became the reason why the German army, despite its superior training and technology and tactics, couldn't sustain its offensive operations. Because every meter cost them. Every victory came with casualties they couldn't replace. Every knocked-out Soviet tank might fire one more time. Every burning wreck might be a trap. The Germans learned to be afraid of disabled Soviet armor. They learned to approach carefully, to check thoroughly, to expect the unexpected, and that caution slowed them down, made them hesitant, gave the Soviets time to regroup, to bring up reinforcements, to prepare the next offense. It's impossible to quantify how much difference that made in the grand scope of the war. But it made some difference, and in a war decided by attrition, every small difference accumulated into the final outcome. So the next time you hear about the Eastern Front, about the massive tank battles and the millions of casualties and the industrial-scale destruction, remember that underneath all those statistics were individual moments like Morozov's. Moments where someone made an insane decision because all the sane decisions led to death anyway. Moments where desperation became tactics. Moments where a sergeant with a wrench turned his dying tank into one last weapon and somehow lived to see the morning. That's the real lesson of the flame trap of Kharkov. Not that Soviet soldiers were superhuman. Not that desperate tactics always work, but that in the worst circumstances imaginable, human beings will find ways to keep fighting. They'll improvise. They'll take terrible risks. They'll do things that make no logical sense because logic itself has broken down, and all that's left is the stubborn refusal to give up without making it cost something. Whether that's admirable or tragic or simply insane probably depends on your perspective. Morozov himself never seemed to know. He survived the war, returned to his village in Tambov Oblast, and worked as a mechanical engineer for a tractor factory until his retirement. When young engineers asked him about his wartime service, he usually changed the subject. When they pressed, he'd say something brief and dismissive. I drove a tank. We shot at Germans. They shot at us. Sometimes we got lucky. Only once, according to his daughter's account given in a 1998 interview with a local history society, did he ever speak about Kharkov in detail. It was Victory Day, May 9th, 1987. He'd had more vodka than usual. His grandchildren were playing in the yard, and his daughter asked him the question she'd been avoiding for decades. Papa, were you scared? He'd looked at her for a long time before answering. Then he said, every second of every day for 4 years I was terrified. But fear is just another thing you learn to work with, like fuel levels or ammunition counts. You feel it, you acknowledge it. Then you do the job anyway because the alternative is letting your crew die for nothing. He paused, watching his grandchildren chase each other around the apple trees he'd planted in 1946, back when he was still having nightmares every night about being trapped inside burning metal. Then he added, the trick at Kharkov wasn't brave. It was just less stupid than the other options. That's what people don't understand about war. Most of the time, you're not choosing between good and bad. You're choosing between bad and worse and catastrophic. And if you're very lucky, you pick the option that kills you a little bit slower than the others. That was the closest he ever came to explaining what it felt like to deliberately set his own tank on fire and wait for the flames to either save him or consume him. His daughter said he never spoke about the war again after that night. He died 6 years later at 73 from lung complications that his doctors attributed to scarring from smoke inhalation decades earlier. His obituary in the Tambov regional newspaper didn't mention Kharkov. It mentioned his work at the tractor factory, his service record, his decorations. The usual things. Kuznetsov outlived him by 11 years. The gunner had moved to Volgograd after the war, working in construction and later as a foreman in a metallurgical plant. He gave a handful of interviews to military historians in the late 90s and early 2000s, usually contradicting himself about the details. In one version, the Panzerfaust hit triggered the fire immediately. In another, Morozov had time to deliberately light the fuel with a flare. In a third, the fire started spontaneously from engine heat, and they simply decided to work with it rather than fight it. When an interviewer pointed out these inconsistencies, Kuznetsov laughed and said, "Brother, I was breathing superheated smoke and thought I was about to die. You remember what you remember. The rest your brain fills in later. All I know for sure is we were inside a burning tank and somehow we're still here talking about it. Everything else is just details. Those details matter, though, or at least they matter to historians trying to understand what actually happened versus what became legend. The problem with oral histories from combat veterans is that memory is unreliable, especially memory formed under extreme stress. The human brain doesn't record traumatic events like a camera. It captures fragments, impressions, emotional states. Later, those fragments get organized into narratives that make sense, that follow cause and effect, that have beginnings and middles and ends. But the original experience was probably much more chaotic, much less coherent than the story that emerges decades later. So what really happened at Kharkov? We have Soviet after-action reports that confirm a T-34 from the 1st Guards Tank Army engaged German forces outside the city on February 22nd and was subsequently recovered with its crew alive but severely injured. We have German casualty reports from the same date listing multiple infantry killed and a half-track destroyed in that sector. We have medical records showing 4 Soviet tankers treated for burns and smoke inhalation. These are facts. Everything else, Morozov's decision-making process, the exact sequence of events, the dramatic moment-by-moment progression, that's reconstruction. Some of it from official reports, some from veteran interviews, some almost certainly from the natural human tendency to turn chaos into story. But here's what makes the story important regardless of its precise accuracy. It represents a documented phenomenon from the Eastern Front. Soviet tank crews, when faced with certain destruction, sometimes chose to fight from disabled vehicles rather than abandon them. Sometimes they used fire as a weapon or a screen. Sometimes this worked, often it didn't. The specific details of Morozov's case might be uncertain, but the general pattern is well established across hundreds of similar incidents. The Germans even developed specific tactical procedures for dealing with Soviet tanks that appeared destroyed but might still be dangerous. Infantry was trained to approach from angles where a disabled tank's remaining gun couldn't traverse. Engineers would sometimes use explosives to ensure wrecks were truly dead before infantry moved past them. Tank commanders were instructed to fire a follow-up round into any Soviet tank that had been hit, but not obviously destroyed, just to be certain. These weren't standard Western Front procedures. They were specific adaptations to Soviet tactical behavior. Why did Soviet crews fight this way? Part of it was doctrine. Soviet military theory emphasized that every soldier, even in the moment of death, had a duty to inflict maximum casualties on the enemy. Retreat was often treated as worse than death, not because of any abstract notion of honor, but because unauthorized retreat could result in execution by NKVD barrier troops. This created a system where fighting to the death from a disabled vehicle might actually be the safer option compared to bailing out and trying to reach friendly lines. But part of it was also something less cynical. Esprit de corps. Soviet tank crews developed intense bonds with their vehicles and each other. The T-34, despite its many flaws, cramped interior, poor visibility, lack of radios in early models, tendency to catch fire when penetrated, was still their home. They'd lived in it, fought in it, survived in it. Abandoning it felt like abandoning a comrade. This might seem irrational, anthropomorphizing a machine, but soldiers have always formed emotional attachments to their weapons and equipment. It's a coping mechanism in an environment where human relationships are constantly severed by death. Morozov embodied both aspects. He stayed in his tank partly because Soviet doctrine demanded it, partly because leaving meant almost certain death from German fire, but also partly because that tank represented the only space in the entire war where he had any agency, any control, any ability to fight back. Inside that steel box, he was still a soldier. He could still make decisions that mattered. He could still hurt the enemy. Outside, in the open, he was just another piece of meat waiting to be destroyed. The flame trap tactic, if we can even call it a tactic rather than a desperate improvisation, died with the war. Modern armor doesn't work the same way. Tanks carry different fuels, have different damage profiles, operate in different tactical contexts. A modern tank crew facing similar circumstances would probably try to destroy their own vehicle rather than let it fall into enemy hands, using thermite grenades or remote detonated charges. They certainly wouldn't try to create a controlled fire and keep fighting through it. Modern safety doctrine and equipment design make such actions unnecessary and largely impossible. But the principle underneath that desperate circumstances call for desperate measures, that even defeat can be weaponized against the enemy, that principle remains relevant. Military academies still study the Eastern Front not because they want to replicate Soviet tactics, but because they want to understand what happens when conventional military theory breaks down. What do soldiers do when every option is terrible? How do small unit leaders make decisions under conditions of extreme stress with incomplete information and no time for deliberation? Morozov's answer was, you remember everything you've ever learned, you improvise based on what's available, and you accept that the outcome is partially beyond your control. You make the best, worst decision you can, and then you execute it completely without hesitation, because hesitation kills you just as surely as enemy fire. That's not a lesson you can really teach in peacetime. It's something that only emerges when people are pushed beyond normal human limits and forced to function anyway. The question that haunts historians who study this incident is whether Morozov made the right call. If he'd ordered his crew to abandon the tank and try to escape on foot, would they have survived? Probably not. The Germans were too close, the terrain too open. They'd have been cut down in seconds. But there's a small chance they might have made it. A shell crater here, a pile of rubble there, enough smoke to mask their retreat. Stranger things happened in war. By staying, Morozov eliminated that small chance of escape in exchange for the certainty of confronting the enemy one more time. He traded a tiny probability of survival through flight for a larger probability of survival through violence. The mathematics of that decision depend entirely on how you estimate the odds, and in combat, nobody has time to calculate odds. You go with your gut, your training, your experience, and you hope you're right. He was right. They survived. But he couldn't have known that when he made the decision. He acted on incomplete information, uncertain outcomes, and the conviction that dying while fighting was preferable to dying while running. That conviction, more than any specific tactical innovation, is what made him representative of the Soviet war effort. Not superhuman courage, not ideological fervor. Just the stubborn, grinding determination to make the enemy pay for every meter, every minute, every life. The Eastern Front produced thousands of stories like this. Most were never recorded. The crews died and took their stories with them. Of the ones that were recorded, most are fragmentary, inconsistent, impossible to verify. Morozov's story survived because his crew survived, because someone filed a report, because the report made it through the chaos of the Soviet military bureaucracy and ended up in archives that historians could eventually access. But for every story like his, there are probably 10 or 20 or 100 similar incidents that disappeared into the vast anonymity of industrial warfare. That anonymity is part of what makes the story so resonant. Morozov wasn't a famous general or a decorated hero or a political commissar with connections. He was a sergeant from a village in Tambov Oblast who drove a tank reasonably well and made one crazy decision that happened to work out. He could have been any of the thousands of Soviet tank commanders grinding their way across Ukraine in the winter of 1943. The fact that we know his name at all is mostly accident, but accidents can be instructive. His story, true or embellished or somewhere in between, tells us something about the nature of that war and the people who fought it. It tells us that desperation breeds innovation, that soldiers under extreme stress will do things that textbooks say are impossible, that the line between heroism and insanity is often invisible in the moment and only becomes clear in hindsight. Most importantly, it tells us that war produces situations where there are no good options, only less terrible ones. Morozov didn't win a glorious victory at Kharkov. He didn't turn the tide of battle or accomplish any strategic objective. He simply survived a situation designed to kill him, and in the process of surviving, he killed some of the people trying to kill him. That's not heroic in any conventional sense. It's just the basic transaction of combat stripped of all romance and mythology. The Soviet propaganda machine tried to turn it into something more. They wanted heroes who embodied Soviet virtues, courage, resourcefulness, devotion to duty. They wanted stories that could be told to factory workers and collective farm laborers to boost morale and productivity. Morozov's story fit those needs, so it got polished and simplified and turned into a morality tale about never surrendering and always fighting to the last. But the real story, the complicated, messy human story, is more interesting than propaganda. It's about a man who was terrified and injured and out of options, who remembered something he'd seen months earlier, who made a split-second decision based on incomplete reasoning, and who got incredibly lucky when that decision somehow worked. It's about the gap between planning and execution, between theory and practice, between what you think will happen and what actually happens when metal is flying and fuel is burning and you can barely breathe. That gap is where war actually lives, not in the official histories or the strategic analyses or the commemorative monuments, in that gap between intention and outcome where chaos and chance and human decision-making collide in ways that are never quite predictable and never quite comprehensible after the fact. Morozov lived in that gap for 4 years. He navigated it successfully enough to survive. And one cold afternoon in February, he made a decision in that gap that became legend. Whether the legend is completely true doesn't really matter. What matters is what it represents. That even in the worst circumstances imaginable, human beings will find ways to fight back. They'll improvise weapons from their own destruction. They'll turn their deaths into one last act of defiance. They'll refuse to go quietly into the darkness. The refusal of millions of Soviet soldiers to quit is what ultimately defeated Nazi Germany. Not a single battle, strategy, or invention, but the sheer weight of people who kept fighting even when death was likely. Morozov chose to fight inside a burning tank, guns still firing. Surviving was secondary. The choice itself mattered. It defined the Eastern Front: keep fighting until the enemy breaks. The enemy broke first, barely, at enormous cost. Amid the grinding attrition, a sergeant from Tambov turned his tank into a flame trap and survived. That's Kharkov's legacy. Not tactics, but the human will to fight, even when hope is gone. Morozov didn't quit, and it made all the difference.